I'm very pleased today to be talking to one of the world's foremost energy transition scholars. It's Dr. James Henderson. He's the director of the Energy Transition Research Initiative at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And we're going to be discussing what is an energy transition. So welcome to the interview, James.
Thanks very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, look, let's start with just the basic question. What is an energy transition?
Well, historically, I think energy transition has involved, if you like, almost this sort of economic and efficiency move from one form of energy, say wood, to another more efficient or more economic form, such as coal, and then from coal to oil, and finally, I guess, the emergence of gas and things like nuclear. So there's been this kind of economic and commercial incentive to transform to a more efficient form of energy, which has bolstered economic growth and also allowed greater energy access to a broader population. This energy transition is different. This is clearly driven by the need to meet climate targets, to meet the challenge of environmental change, human-inspired environmental change that's been going on, and essentially the need to decarbonize the global energy system in response to, I guess, what we can define as a climate crisis. And so this energy transition is really about the transformation of the entire global energy system away from carbon emitting sources of energy to carbon free sources of energy. And it's also about removing potentially carbon from the atmosphere, either post burning of hydrocarbons or just direct air capture of carbon in order to bring down the levels of carbon in the atmosphere. So this transition is less about economics in the short term, at least. I mean, one can argue about whether it's about economics in the longer term. It's more about a climate crisis, an environmental crisis that we need to resolve by decarbonizing the atmosphere.
Now, what do you make of the argument, James, that technology is also a very significant driver, and at this point in the energy transition, maybe the most important driver, because there are literally thousands of new energy technologies, whether it's, folks will know wind and solar and electric vehicles, all of the big ones, but behind the scenes, thousands and thousands of new technologies that are affecting how we use energy and which energies we use. And I think of artificial intelligence would be a big one that plays a role in utilities and EVs, all that sort of thing. What would you make of that argument that technology is as important as policy, or even maybe more important?
Okay, I mean, I think the answer to the question is that technology is absolutely central to the energy transition. Whether it's a driver and a catalyst, I think is a moot point. I mean, policy, I would argue, is the greater catalyst, in as much as policymakers and politicians have to address the issue of climate change and the need for decarbonization. And technology is going to be the critical factor as to the speed at which, and indeed whether we can meet the targets that have been set for limiting temperature rises and achieving the other kind of environmental goals, and also within those environmental goals, the energy access goals and the climate justice goals that we have set ourselves. Clearly, technology can be a huge driver in as much as it enhances the efficiency of energy consumption, as well as the efficiency of energy production. And I think we can see in terms of with artificial intelligence, with digitalization, with all forms of technological advances I'm sure listeners are aware of and have individual knowledge of, are enhancing the efficiency of the energy system. But I would argue that in terms of the pace of change that is required and the kind of overall global cooperation that is going to be required to implement the energy transition and to achieve the goals on a timescale, pretty rapid timescales now, I would argue that policy is going to be increasingly critical. And I think, some of the other drivers are indeed, well, to an extent, markets, capital markets, particularly in investors, the other stakeholders out there who are looking at the challenges that the world faces in terms of the environment, and indeed are looking at the risks involved in climate change, both to the companies that currently exist, but also for their investors, for example, in pension funds, who are actually going to be cashing in their pensions in perhaps 40 or 45 years' time, and they're having to think about the world in which those people will be living, and how their investments will look in 2060, 2075. So I think there's another key driver as well.
Well, let's talk about the pace of energy transitions. In the past, I think, rule of thumb, maybe 50 years, 75 years to do an energy transition, but there's never been one quite like this. Now, Professor Vaclav Smil, who is one of our foremost scholars on energy transitions, argues that they're very slow. And this one will be very slow. Then there are others, and I think of Kingsmill Bond from Carbon Tracker, who I've interviewed, and viewers can check out our energy student resources portal for his interviews. He argues it'll be much quicker for a variety of reasons. What's your take on this? Fast or slow?
I know the arguments of both the gentlemen you've mentioned, and I think one is being perhaps super realistic, if you like, in taking the view that things take a long time. And I think one is being, I hesitate to say over optimistic, but certainly is trying to catalyze change by encouraging it to happen very rapidly. I think what I would say is that the transition clearly needs to accelerate. We are behind where we need to be in terms of meeting our targets. So I would certainly say it needs to be fast, but I think that arguments around the exact speed and what the transition involves kind of miss a main point, which is that we all need to be involved here. I don't think you can just sort of discard hydrocarbon producers and say they shouldn't be involved and we should just stop all use of hydrocarbons, because clearly it's a massive part of the current system. I mean, moving away from 80% reliant on hydrocarbons to something which is decarbonized is a massive challenge. And so that would argue to Vaclav Smil's, that it will take time. On the flip side of that, clearly the carbon budget is being used up pretty rapidly. And so the necessity is that we move pretty rapidly. But I would say that necessity means encouraging everyone from hydrocarbon producers through the developers of zero carbon technologies. We all got to move together. And therefore, the need is for us to move fast. And I think the need is for us to be relatively technology neutral about this and to accept, if you like, offers, if you like, accept suggestions, ideas on how to decarbonize the existing system, as well as to produce a new system which is zero carbon. I think it's going to be a combination of those two, and I think arguments about whether it's going to be slow or fast, or should be slow or fast, is kind of misses the point. We all need to work together as rapidly as we can to decarbonize the current system and to develop a new system.
Well, James, you recently wrote a paper for the Oxford Energy Institute in which you set out some of the key issues for this energy transition, and there are 10 of them. So I want to go through each one, and starting with policy and regulation and the importance of getting policy right. I've interviewed many experts who talk about this, and if you get the policy and regulation wrong, you can cause damage, you can impede the progress of the energy transition. What's your take on that?
So I think the question on policy is that because essentially this transition is not being driven by kind of efficiency and lower cost, it's being driven by an external need to reduce carbon emissions, and the technologies and the energy sources that, and initially at least, are being used have been higher cost, then clearly policy is an absolutely critical driver. And for me, the key question that policymakers have to ask themselves is how they essentially correct the market failure of the failure to price the externality of the impact of carbon. And they're clearly doing that by providing incentives in terms of subsidies, contracts for difference, to encourage the development of new technologies, and also providing, using a stick, if you like, to reduce the consumption and production of hydrocarbons. And it's that balance between the two which is critical. And I think where the difficult balance that policymakers have to find is that transition, I mean, the point is, it is a transition, it is a move. It is not, we're not going to flick a light switch here and suddenly move from a situation where we're emitting lots of carbon to one where we're not. We're going to move over a period of 20 to 30 years. And therefore, the balance is finding a way to encourage existing producers to decarbonize and existing consumers to reduce their consumption of unabated hydrocarbons, while also encouraging investment in zero carbon technologies. And if you get the balance wrong and you disincentivize the production of hydrocarbons too rapidly, you get huge price volatility, potentially energy shortages. And I think the other difficulty here is balancing policy across a global audience. I mean, Europe's clearly leading the way here in terms of decarbonisation. The US is following very rapidly, and other countries are picking up the baton with net zero targets. But clearly, there are, in a developing world, there are much sort of more fundamental issues of energy access and cost to address, and economic growth to address, and environment is not at the top of the agenda. So I think it is a difficult balancing act for policymakers, and there's no doubt that the challenges are immense. But I think that the key element here is getting the balance right and not kind of going too far on one side of the pendulum on the other. And I think clearly the negotiations in Glasgow around COP26 are going to have to address a lot of these issues, particularly that balance between developed and developing world and the different motivations in the energy transition for those two parties.
Well, let's talk about key issue number 2, which is technology. Do we have all of the technology we need, or are we waiting on the development? Is the energy transition dependent on the development of new technologies, which is, let's say hydrogen, it could be small modular reactors, any number of those, but many of them might not even be available until the 2030s. So do we have everything we need now, or are we dependent on the development of new zero carbon technologies?
So I think we have a lot of what, I mean, you've talked about kind of wind and solar being the kind of the things that everyone knows about, and clearly costs are continuing to fall, and that's a critical element in terms of costs are continuing to fall. The efficiencies of the technology are continuing to improve, and I guess given the timescales involved, we're going to have to rely on those technologies to do a lot of the work, because we need to meet targets by 2030. It's not just about 2050. We've got to keep meeting targets along the way if we're really going to have a chance to keep the carbon intensity of the atmosphere at acceptable levels. So I think, do we have all that we need? No, clearly not. We have to work with what we've got in the next decade. Beyond that, I think there are interesting questions to be answered about some of the technologies that are being put forward. I mean, hydrogen is a very good example. Do we have everything we need? Well, we can make hydrogen through steam reforming of methane. We then need to store the CO2 that is emitted after that. And we also need to answer questions around the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, including methane emissions, in the value chain of the methane before it even gets converted into hydrogen, to answer the question whether blue hydrogen, for example, is an answer. With green hydrogen, do we have technology? Well, yes, we have electrolyzers, and yes, we have electricity. But to make truly green hydrogen, we need renewable electricity. The efficiencies involved mean that any renewable electricity we have at the moment should be put into the grid, not used to make hydrogen. We should really be using either surplus renewable electricity or dedicated plants for making green hydrogen. We're clearly not in a place to do that to any great volume at the moment. So in terms of hydrogen, no, we don't have we have the technologies, we do not have the capability and the logic, if you like, in place yet, the capacity to make sufficient amounts. However, over the next 20 to 30 years, it's clearly an option. Battery technology is clearly another area where development is needed. And we need to be able to increase the sort of capacity and reduce the cost of batteries so that they can help solve the intermittency problem of renewables. And then there are things that we know about in terms of the nuclear fusion, and which could be the answer to everything. So still plenty of potential for new technologies to come in and solve a lot of the problems as well.
Now, you mentioned a couple of technologies, like nuclear and hydrogen. Uh, can you address like what are the a key 3 to 5 clean, zero emission technologies?
Well, I think the number one, I think for me, is battery technology. I mean, I think if we can address the battery technology issue, if we can store particularly renewable electricity when there's a surplus, and obviously then use it when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, that is going to be a make a major contribution to balancing the electricity system and to making clean electricity available. So I think that is probably the number one technology. I think given that electrification is a major part of any energy transition towards a decarbonized world, clearly technologies around managing the grid, balancing supply and demand, smart grids, digitalization, artificial intelligence to allow us to optimize both the demand and the supply side are going to be critical as well. And then I think in terms of other technologies, well, I think if we're going to achieve this in the most cost efficient manner, I think we're going to have to, not have to, but it would be very good if we could reuse some of the infrastructure that is already existing rather than having to build completely new infrastructure. I happen to come from a gas background, so for me, the question around reusing natural gas infrastructure is one that looks very efficient, and I certainly think that as a backup to the kind of electricity sector, particularly electricity sector dominated by renewables, then some form of gaseous fuel is going to be pretty critical, I think. Clearly, it has to be abated. So the development, I think, of economic carbon capture and storage, because inevitably hydrocarbons are going to be an important part of the energy supply chain over the next 20 to 30 years. It is almost impossible to conceive of a world where there are zero hydrocarbons consumed in the period between now and 2050. And therefore, if those are going to be decarbonized, we're going to need carbon capture and storage technologies to really move on at a pace. And so I think that is an absolutely critical technology as well.
Let's talk about some of the sectoral developments, and generally we think of them in 4 sectors: electricity systems, transportation, buildings, and industry. My take is that electricity systems are well on their way with wind and solar and batteries and different types of storage, the smart grids, all of the things you mentioned. Transportation is ramping up rapidly, but buildings and industry, decarbonizing those are still behind. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think the heat sector is absolutely the key question. Certainly in Europe, where I sit, the building stock is not amenable to rapid change, and so therefore improving the efficiency of heating, I mean insulation and other forms of reducing demand are difficult to implement. And also, I think that the whole electrification of the industrial sector as well raises challenges in terms of when industrial processes need very high temperatures, electricity is not always a particularly applicable answer. Comes back to my previous answer around the need for some form of gaseous fuel to allow those processes to be decarbonized, obviously an abated gaseous fuel. So I think I would agree. I mean, the power sector, certainly in Europe, and in other parts of the world as well, but certainly in Europe, has been the main focus. It's been, if not the easy win, there's been an obvious solution, which is wind and solar. Whereas in the buildings and industrial sectors, the challenges are now emerging. It is the big challenge, I think, for the 2030s, is to find ways to improve the housing stock, to decarbonize industrial processes, and clearly we are seeing efforts to do that, particularly in industries like steel. So moves towards green steel, but that does take a complete restructuring in some industries of the industrial processes, which is clearly not low cost. and therefore questions around, how that's financed, how incentives are provided, are absolutely critical. And I think we're at a relatively early stage of answering that question.
Well, let's talk about finance now. The International Energy Agency has published some estimates of the trillions and trillions of dollars it's going to take to finance the energy transition between now and 2050. Are we going to be able to mobilize enough capital to do that? And if where is it going to come from? The private sector, government? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's going to have to be a combination of the two. I think the public sector is going to have to provide the initial impetus, I think, and certainly find a way of reducing risks, or at least sharing risks and providing the investment incentives. I think that the financial community clearly sees an opportunity here as well. I mean, this is not just about risk. This is about opportunity as well. And I think that there are clear opportunities for technological developments, for the development of almost new industries, or at least completely transformed industries, where market leaders will have significant profit-making opportunities, assuming policymakers follow through and can provide some stability of outlook in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And I think that comes back to why policy and regulation is absolutely critical here, because we're not going to raise the finance, and certainly we're not going to raise the finance in the private sector unless the risk parameters are at least defined. I think that the private sector is clearly prepared to take risk, but only if it can define what the upsides and downsides within reasonable estimates are. And I think we have seen clearly the financial community putting pressure on companies. I mean, we only need to look at the oil companies, Exxon and Chevron in the US, the legal pressure being put on Shell. Clearly, the financial community is motivated. The development of ESG funds, is clearly shows that there is a will here, and that opportunity has been identified. But I think the playing field needs to be established with a bit more certainty before we're going to see, as you say, the trillions of dollars per annum that the IEA has identified as being needed, but before that comes, into the market.
Well, let's talk about the next key issue, which is networks. And you had mentioned, your background in gas. You were talking about repurposing some of this infrastructure. How much of it do you think we'll be able to repurpose, and how much are we going to have to build new? Well,
that really, and being the gas sector, that will really come down to whether gas can be decarbonized. Will hydrogen work? Will CCUS become a major force? I mean, this is true for all hydrocarbons, really. I mean, I think the assets are going to ultimately be stranded unless they can be decarbonized. We're not going to meet zero emissions targets while continuing to use significant amounts of hydrocarbon unless we can implement some form of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I think just looking at the gas, for example, certainly pipes can be repurposed. Valves need to be replaced, compressor stations need to be adjusted. In some instances, pipes need to be replaced, and we may have dual systems, and clearly there needs to be some form of CO2 transportation as well. So the risk is clearly out there that the assets become stranded, and it will really come down to whether the technologies can be developed at a pace to allow the existing assets to be utilised. I mean, in the UK, it's the major topic of conversation at National Grid, and I'm sure at TSOs across Europe. I mean, I know it is amongst TSOs across Europe. So, how will we know? Well, I mean, governments ultimately will have to set policy. I mean, hydrogen strategies are being developed, both at an EU level and at a country level. And obviously we're seeing hydrogen strategies in other parts of the world outside Europe as well. Those policies and strategies will have to be turned into realistic plans. And so companies will have to know whether to invest in the repurposing of their pipelines or not. And so that will come down to, again, coming back to government policy decisions. There'll be economics arguments around that, of course. But I think an interesting question will be whether markets can be left fully to kind of make these decisions, or whether governments are going to have to step in and, in some instances, even pick winners. It certainly isn't ideal economic theory to have the state picking winners, but given the timescales we've got to get this job done, we are at least asking ourselves at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies whether there may have to be some element of significant government intervention to decide which bits of infrastructure are staying and which are going, if we're going to meet the targets in time. So there is clearly a big risk of stranded assets.
Well, let's talk about the impact on consumers. And so you were mentioning, can we leave it to markets? And obviously consumers make up an important part of those markets. And I remember interviewing, 3, 4, 5 years ago, pollsters talking about attitudes towards electric vehicles, for instance. And, it tended to be college educated, high income, green oriented consumers, and that's changing. And it seems that consumers are changing their attitudes towards electric vehicles, to wind and solar and batteries, all of those things. Have they changed much, and are they likely to change quickly?
I guess I'll answer that question as someone who's purchased an electric car recently. When I purchased the electric car, I made a kind of an environmental and a kind of what I would regard as almost a moral, ethical choice, because it certainly wasn't an economic choice. And I think I fortunately had the ability to make that choice. The vast majority of people do not have that ability to make that choice. They are driven by the economics of the situation. And I think that it is just a fact that consumers, and my experience is obviously in the UK and Europe, consumers respond largely to economic incentive. I mean, I think the consumer view of electric cars and wind and solar has undoubtedly changed. I would agree with that. There is much more sympathy and desire for them. They are a much more, particularly electric cars, a much more attractive offer now. But at the end of the day, money talks. And I think, I hope that if enough momentum is built up, prices will be able to fall, and the economics of owning an electric vehicle will come into line with the economics of owning an internal combustion engine vehicle. And again, we come back to government policy and the banning of internal combustion engine cars in cities, potentially the adjustment of tax take to encourage greater use of electric cars. But I think it will be that. I mean, I think, yes, customers are ready. They're certainly ready to buy electric cars. They're ready to buy renewable electricity. And certainly, the offers from companies to sell them green electricity are certainly being taken up. But at the end of the day, to get mass participation, which is clearly what's needed. I mean, people like me buying electric cars is neither here nor there. We need mass participation here. That will have to come down to economic incentive, and that will have to come down to governments taking decisions about either, again, that carrot and stick, either offering the incentive or, using the stick, banning cars outright, or just creating a tax environment where it doesn't make sense anymore to own an internal combustion engine.
Now, the last couple of years, we've been hearing a lot more about just transitions and making sure that the workers who hydrocarbons or fossil fuels are displaced, that they get some support and retraining, but also issues of equity, that those in lower income and racialized communities aren't affected disproportionately. What's your take on that?
So the just transition, I think, is much broader than that. I mean, I think that the question of just transition is a global one. I mean, yes, it's about workers in the oil and gas industries. It's about various poorer communities being able to afford energy through the energy transition. I think in the developed countries, that's for governments to redistribute wealth to ensure that all portions of no one element of society is disadvantaged. However, I think the whole just transition question is really the question of the balance between the developed countries and the developing countries, and this is going to be a massive topic at COP26. We've had commitments from developed countries to fund $100 billion per annum to ensure that the transition can be financed in the developing world. We need funding to ensure that the developing world, that countries that are most at risk from the transition can adapt, can respond, if water levels start to rise or if there are other impacts of the transition. We need to ensure that as we transition towards a zero carbon economy, that those without access to energy at the moment, and as the IEA has pointed out, there are billions of people without access to electricity, without access to even heating for cooking. We need to make sure that those people are not left behind as we all try and transition. And so I think there are multiple layers of this, which are potentially going to be hugely problematic when it comes to the diplomacy around the negotiations that we're going to see at COP26. We know that this is going to get brought up by many of the developing world countries, rightly so. And there will need to be a robust response from the developed world, or else we are going to struggle to get the global cooperation that we need. So I think the just transition questions are there are some domestic and local questions around communities and varying levels of wealth and ability to respond. And then there are global questions around the developed and the developing world.
Let's talk about the next key issue, James, which is business models. And I've done a fair number of interviews with, oil and gas companies that are thinking about the future, and some are looking at low carbon business models, and some are thinking that they can decarbonize their existing business model without investing in net zero, in low carbon technologies, that sort of thing. What's your take on the ability to adapt existing business models and develop new ones?
I think it is a very difficult question, because I guess the question is, if you're going to adapt to develop a new business model, the question I think your shareholders are clearly going to ask is, are you the best company to suddenly become, if you're an oil and gas producer, do you really have the transferable skills to become a major developer of wind power and to operate in the electricity market and to operate much more closely with consumers? Do you have those transferable skills? I mean, in terms of engineering and developing of large projects, yes, you probably do. But do you have the different market skills? Are the returns in the two businesses compatible? Are your expectations as a shareholder going to be met, or would you just rather take your money and invest it somewhere, in a company that has the experience that's required? So it is a difficult question. I think that the mainly European companies, to start with at least, that are making that gradual shift, I think are largely arguing that they're using hydrocarbon revenues, which they're going to sustain, to develop and invest in, to provide the large amounts of capital, coming back to one of the earlier questions, that will be required in the energy transition. And I think there is an argument around that, which is that the companies that have the capital need to reinvest it elsewhere, and as they shift their business model, they transfer capital from one side of the business to the other. I think, to your point about decarbonisation, though, I think the real question that any company that remains in the hydrocarbon industry really has to answer is, can you decarbonise your current business? Because your current business is going to carry on. Even you look at a company like Equinor or even BP, who are making massive shifts towards a greener energy transition focused business, they're still running oil and gas fields, and they still need to answer significant questions around methane leakage, around greenhouse gas emissions in their value chain, and around some of the assertions they're making about achieving net zero across scope 1, 2, and 3. And one of the things that we're looking at in Oxford is the definition of the methodology and around the reporting, the verification of and definition of the emissions in the carbon value chain, in the sort of the hydrocarbon value chain. And I think, for me, any company that is either deciding to stay in hydrocarbons but to try and decarbonize its existing value chain, or to move while supporting its business with hydrocarbon revenues, really needs to answer that question. Because in a net zero world, you're going to have to show, you have to be very, very transparent about what the emissions in your system are, how you've decarbonized them, and what the answer is now if you're going to achieve net zero. And this comes down to, not just questions of decarbonizing the value chain and getting rid of the emissions, but also some of those companies using offsets to carbon offsets to achieve net zero, and how they're doing that as well. So I think some significant questions to be answered.
Let's talk about the hydrocarbon markets over time. There are, for instance, if you look at the International Energy Agency, they've got a variety of scenarios. In the business as usual, we go from 100 million barrels a day of oil, for instance, today to maybe 90 in 2050, but in their net zero scenario, it declines to 30 million barrels a day. So maybe you could address oil and then gas separately. And what's your take on how fast those two hydrocarbons will decline over time, if in fact they even do?
So I think the prognosis for oil, I would argue, is worse than for gas, although we've seen very little evidence of it so far. Oil hasn't really been challenged yet, which I think is quite an interesting observation, whereas gas has been challenged. Gas has been challenged in the power sector. But I think for the longer term future, gas looks like, it is a lower carbon emitting hydrocarbon, and it appears to have the opportunity to be decarbonized slightly more easily than oil. So I think that if one was going to make a prognosis for oil, which obviously is dominated by the transport sector, then on the assumption that we do see the acceleration of electrification of the transport sector and the use of other forms of decarbonized energy, perhaps decarbonized gases in the transport sector, then you would think that beyond 2030 there is a significant decline curve for oil. Now, the net zero scenario that the IEA painted is clearly just one pathway. It's not, I mean, the IEA have said this clearly, it's one pathway, it's not the pathway. So, in that particular pathway, oil demand fell to 30 million barrels a day. That is obviously an extreme example. There are other scenarios where it clearly falls less than that. And I guess, my expectation would be that it probably wouldn't get down to 30, but it's heading towards somewhere like 50 by 2050. And so, I think unless some form of carbon capture and storage can really be found, to operate at a kind of micro level, in individual vehicles. For gas, I think the prognosis is somewhat better, mainly because there is still, in Asia particularly, significant gain to be made from coal to gas switching in terms of reducing carbon emissions. In Europe, I think, and in the US, we've played that story out, but in China, in Indonesia, in India, there are dramatic savings that can be made with a coal to gas switching. Now, it's not the ideal final future solution you'd like to get to. Clearly, the gases will be challenged by renewables at some point, and there may even be some countries that switch straight from coal to renewables. But the suspicion is, or the strong evidence would suggest, that gas will play a significant bridging role in Asia. And given the growth of energy demand in Asia, it would look like gas has a big role to play, and therefore gas demand will fall less rapidly. In addition, if we can see decarbonisation plans around technologies like hydrogen, around carbon capture and storage at power stations, and in the development of blue hydrogen, then I think, again, the methane demand can stay relatively robust. It will still fall. I mean, we still expect gas demand to fall, but I think the gradient of the decline is probably less rapid than the gradient of the decline for oil.
Let's talk about the regions now. And I think everybody agrees that the energy transition will be asymmetrical. That is, not all regions will proceed at the same pace. You could see North America, Europe, China, Japan, South Korea. The most advanced economies will go the quickest, and maybe the developing economies next, and least advanced economies bringing up the rear. What's your take on the relative pace for those three broad regions?
So I think in terms of the first grouping, I think even within that grouping, there are clearly different challenges. But overarching it, I would say there is a positive argument, which is that they will start to compete. I mean, the energy technology for the energy transition will become an area of significant competition, both politically and economically, and that could catalyze more rapid change in the developed countries, the ones you've mentioned, North America, Europe, China, Japan, Korea, and others. There could be a surge as those countries and regions look to develop the technologies which, one, enhance their ability to produce their own energy domestically, therefore improving the energy their energy security, and two, because the technologies themselves can be an area of competitive advantage, global competitive advantage, political and economic. So I think that there could really be a surge. Then the developing economies, depending on how rapidly they are developing, again, in those countries, in a positive scenario, you could see a jump. You could see that in terms of gas being the bridging fuel, for example, one could see a jump from the existing energy system to a decarbonized system without the need for a bridge. We could see that the technologies developed and brought to fruition in the developed world could catalyze more rapid change in those developing economies, as long as the finance is available and technology is transferred. In the least advanced economies, I think that clearly in the short to medium term, issues of energy access that we've already discussed are going to be paramount. I mean, renewable sources of energy can play a role there. I mean, certainly solar in obviously sunnier countries, particularly can play a role in providing energy in remote areas to communities that could move straight from biomass. So I wouldn't discard the opportunity there, but clearly one would expect perhaps the pace of change not to be quite so rapid because there are other priorities. But one shouldn't ignore the fact that renewable energy can provide an immediate source of energy access there as well. I think, though, that the one thing I would caution on in terms of the pace of change is if energy security and geopolitics don't play a positive role in as much as they don't encourage competition, they encourage a defensive attitude and a lack of technology transfer and a kind of more introverted strategy where each country and region looks after itself, hides its technology, only develops for the domestic market. Then I think potentially that slows things down and is not helpful at all. And I think then questions around trade wars between the US and China, the impact of sanctions on countries like Russia and China come to the fore. This is not to say that the sanctions aren't valid, and there are obviously reasons for them, but clearly you can paint a picture of a world where these regions and countries kind of compete in a positive way to bring forward technology as fast as possible to create competitive advantage, or you can paint a picture of a world where in a world of less cooperation, less competition, more introverted and introspective energy strategy, these technologies are kind of held domestically, and we don't see the kind of positive feedback loops that one might otherwise see. It's too early to tell which way it could go, but within the asymmetries that you've described, I think there are those two possible scenarios for that we should bear in mind.
Well, that leads to the final question, James, and the potential for the energy transition. And I think I've taken this from your paper, the transition becoming a disorderly mess. Looking from our vantage point today, are we headed towards a disorderly mess? Are we doing actually a pretty good job of managing it and keeping this on a trajectory that will lead to a better future than the one we have today?
I think it's too early to say it's going to be a disorderly mess. I think what you can say is that a lot of promises have been made, and that's encouraging because 5 years ago no promises had been made. So we have taken steps down the road. Clearly, Paris in 2015, COP21 was a major turning point in terms of the diplomacy around environmental negotiations. COP26 in Glasgow is going to be another critical point where we're going to get a very clear indication of whether cooperation going forward is going to be, whether we can see cooperation going forward, whether governments are going to refine their targets towards 2030 so that marking post, if you like, can be seen as one where we are on the road to either a net zero world or certainly a world in which we keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees increase by 2050 or not. However, I think what we would argue from the Oxford Institute is that while the past 5 to 6 years, in particular the past 3 to 4 years, has seen positive statements from policymakers, and clearly the shift in US policy over the last 6 months has been part of that. The statements from China about net zero targets by 2060, many other countries and regions, including the UK and the EU, setting 2050 or even earlier as net zero targets, is all very positive. Now is the time for action. And so it's too early to say whether we are on the road to a sort of a halcyon future or complete chaos, because we're at a point now where the promises have been made, and now we need to see policies, regulations being put in place by governments. And we also need to see companies really stepping up, and, albeit they need policymakers to make decisions and create a kind of an overall strategic route map for them to follow. But companies now have made net zero promises. They also need to step up. And I think, with hydrocarbon companies, one of the easiest things we see that they can do is to address the methane emissions question, because it is just the big elephant in the room at the moment with hydrocarbons. And there is a need for transparency around what those emissions are, and there's a need for transparency about what's being done about those emissions. And they need to be reported both to their own shareholders and stakeholders, but to the wider community at large. And I think so. Therefore, the message I think from me would be: we're moving along the right path. Promises are being made. That's all well and good. The 2020s from here to 2030 is a time for action, because we need to see significant investment in place in specific assets, and from both the public and private sector in a major infrastructure development by 2030, or else we really are going to be in a bit of a mess.
Well, James, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights, and we'll look forward to further interviews.
Thank you very much, Lee. It's been a pleasure.